The season of revelation. Morghur was reborn again, and a great war herd of beastmen soon gathered to him. This time the wild horde did not descend upon Athaloran, but rampaged through the human tribal lands west of the forest. According to the scouts who shadowed Morghur's trail, his destination was quite clear. If the path of destruction held true, his herd was making for a mountain known to the Elves as the Silver Spire, a shining peak from which the lifeblood of the western lands flowed. Ariel knew this was a site of ancient power, and knew also that Morghur could not be permitted to befoul its waters. Although not as mighty as they once were, the roots of Athaloran dug deep, and drew sustenance from many of the lands fed by the waters of the Silver Spire. Ariel did not dare face Morghur herself, for the beast's touch had weakened her terribly when she last confronted him. Orion had no such misgivings. Indeed, he longed for the opportunity to slaughter the beast who had dared to harm his beloved queen. The elves that travelled with Orion were swept up in his great fury, and they unleashed great ruin upon the human lands that lay in their path. But the elves cared not, for the slain were only humans, and therefore of little account. Only when the wild hunt reached the slopes of the Silver Spire was its wrath finally slaked. With spear and with arrow the wood elves drove the beastmen from the sacred confluence and into the waiting claws of the dryads. Orion himself tore Morghur limb from limb, and tossed the corrupt remains into a cleansing starward pyre. No other living being did the elves encounter on the Silver Spire, yet still Orion sensed another presence there, not unlike to his queen, and those unspoken whispers echoed through his mind. When Orion brought word of this back to Athaloran, none were more intrigued than Ariel. The Mage Queen had long believed that Morghur was scarcely aware of his own actions, and that the Chaos Gods guided his steps. It was only they who drove the Corruptor to devour her and Orion, to consume the godly essence of Isha and Kuranos, as his dark masters had all but consumed the elven gods. Thus were the wars of the heavens echoed in the mortal realm. Seldom had Ariel given thought to the idea that there might be others like her and Orion. Certainly she had not encountered them, but if there were, it was likely that Morghur would be driven to devour these also. Many turnings of the world later, this theory seemed to be all but proven. Morghur was again reborn in the lands west of Athaloran, and was drawn to the Silver Spire once more. Again the Wood Elves marched to thwart Morghur's advance. This time, however, they had allies in the struggle against the Corruptor. Since last the Elves had striven with Morghur, the rough humans of the western lands had united under the banner of a mighty champion. The Silver Spire was sacred ground to these primitives, and they now too mustered to its defence. It would have gone ill for the humans had Orion led the second Wood Elf host, for the King in the Woods had little fondness for such humans. As it was, the midwinter snows laid heavy on Athaloran. Orion was naught but a memory and a hope, so cooler heads than his prevailed, and an alliance was struck. And so, together, men and elves cleansed the land of Morghur's taint. The season of retribution. Before long, Morghur rose again, this time in the Forest of Shadows. On this occasion, Ariel resolved that the creature's corruption would be stilled once and for all. She would consume his power, as he had ever tried to devour hers. The Mage Queen sent a host north through the wood roots, and they soon brought Morghur's warherd to battle. As they had before, the Wood Elves found the Corruptor all but immune to their weapons, but Ariel had planned against this circumstance. Indeed, she relied upon it. At the battle's height, Ariel directed a great convocation of spellsingers to snare Morghur and transport him through the wood roots to the Oak of Ages. There she bound the foul creature with all the dark magics at her command, and began the ritual that would take his power for her own. She would have succeeded in this disastrous plan had it not been for Durthu. The Elder had felt the disturbance as the Corruptor had been brought along the wood roots, and was outraged that their sanctity would be so violated. Hastening to the Oak of Ages, he slew Morghur before the ritual could be completed. Ariel screamed and railed at Durthu, but dared do no more. Even deluded as she was, the Mage Queen knew better than to harm one of the elders, so she let him depart, claiming ever after that it was mercy, rather than weakness, that stayed her hand. season of redemption. In all, Ariel spent more than 3 centuries hidden from the world. It is likely that she would have tarried longer had she not discovered that Morghur had been reborn. Ariel sensed that his incarnation was more powerful than any that had preceded it, and that all of Athaloran would need to unite to defeat him. In truth, the Mage Queen's soul was still not fully cleansed, and she worried on the wisdom of going forth unhealed. But she knew that dire times had ever required dire sacrifice, and emerged at last from the Oak of Ages. Great was the rejoicing that day. The Wood Elves had all but given up on their queen for lost, and now welcomed her without reservation. Even the spirits of the forest, who had longer memories than the Elves, and who had borne the brunt of Ariel's madness, felt joy at her return, though few would admit it. Most joyous was the reunion between Ariel and Orion, for they had spent long centuries of sadness and anger apart. The celebrations were tempered not one whit by the knowledge that Ariel's return coincided with the eve of another great battle. If the Corruptor had returned their queen to them, said the Elves, then at least the misbegotten creature had done something wholesome with his vile existence. None of them saw the dark spirit of malice that still lurked in Ariel's spirit. A taint of darkness can never fully be driven once it has taken root. A burden the Mage Queen would have to bear ever after. Often its darkness would call to her in the still watches of the night, when hope seemed lost. In the ages after, Ariel would never truly know which of her decisions were out of malice rather than reason. A month later, as the outside world reckons time, Morghur's war herd was brought to battle in the forest of Arden. The beast had already annihilated an army of knights riding from nearby Gisaro, and doubtless believed that the host of the Elves arrayed before him would fall just as easily. He was wrong. Having been forced to confront the darkness within her own soul, Ariel had lost her fear of Morghur and had accompanied her folk to war. Though she was content to let Orion command the battle, Ariel marched and overcame the dark sorceries of the Bray Shamans with her own magics. Worse too for the beastmen was that Naestra and Arahan, the Sisters of Twilight, and the legendary heroes of Athaloran, had accompanied the Elves to war. They had fought not at their mistress's side, as perhaps might have been expected, but roamed far and free upon the back of a mighty dragon. Naestra's purity was anathema to the beastmen, and her very presence burned them like fire. Yet the children of Chaos did not flee her coming, for Aran fought ever at her sister's side. The Shadowed Twins' dark nature was an irresistible lure to the beastmen, and they pursued her with mad hunger. Few survived long enough to reach their quarry, and those that did had their vile throats slit by Arahan's wicked knives. At the last, their ranks scythed down by arrows, or scattered by the hooves of the wild hunt, the beastmen could take no more. As one, the war herd turned and melted away into the woods. Only Morghur stood his ground, gibbering his wild madness at those who came to claim his life. The Corruptor was gravely wounded, his hide pierced by many arrows, but still the will of the dark gods drove him to defiance. Then a final bowstring sang, and at last Morghur fell dead, a black arrow protruding from his eye socket. Great was the feasting in Athaloran when the host returned. Many heroes had made their names that day. Most lauded of these was Scarlock, the archer whose arrow had finally felled the Master of Skulls. But there was glory aplenty in which all the Elves could share. Thus passed the season of redemption. Ariel and Orion were at last reunited, and the Wood Elves' sundered spirits were again made whole. One day, there was a great wailing amongst the trees of the Glade of Woe, and Ariel knew that Morghur had been reborn once more. Scouts soon located the vile creature in the forest of Arden, and no longer content to let others keep the Corruptor in check, the Mage Queen dispatched an army to kill the beast while still young. So it was that Araloth, Lord of Talsine, and Nath, the prophetess, led many warrior kin bands on the hunt. They tracked Morghur and his war herd through the darkness of the forest, felling stragglers with bow and blade. At last, they routed Morghur's followers. They cornered the beast. Alas, As Owloth readied his blade for the killing strike, the air rang to the blare of crude horns and the bleating of unclean beasts. So intent had the Wood Elves been on reaching their quarry, they had not noticed the Ungor scouts shadowing their every step. Now those trackers had led other beastmen to Morghur's rescue, and badly outnumbered, the Wood Elves were forced to retreat. Up until now, the Wood Elves' casualties had been light, for they had chosen the ground upon which their battles had been fought. Now the beastmen took their bloody revenge. The Glade Guard fired until their quivers were empty, but there were always more beasts to replace those that had been slain. With a heart twisted by anger and sorrow, Ariel left a rearguard of volunteers to hold back the raging Gors, and led the last of his force on a desperate retreat out of the forest of Arden. At the last, only Nath, Ariel, and a handful of others escaped the forest of Arden. They survived only because Nath roused the slumbering trees to form walls of branch and briar that barred the beastmen's passage. Shamed by his failure, Ariel soon returned to the forest of Arden as part of a far larger host, but Morghur was gone. The beastmen had used their primitive magic to spirit the creature away. It would be many years before Ariel would have his chance at revenge. The Battle of Arden. Morghur was once more revealed within the forest of Arden, and Ariel of the Hooked Blade begged to leave to lead the hunt. At first, Ariel refused the plea, for she knew full well how revenge could wound the Seeker. In this she was opposed by Orion, who argued Ariel's case and, at the last, convinced his queen to agree. When Ariel set out to hunt Morghur for the second time, he did so at the head of a mighty host. They passed overland through Bretonnia, concealing themselves through the curious eyes of peasants and knights alike by means of a sorcerous mist. They arrived at the forest of Arden to find it heavy with corruption and the scent of debased magic on the air. Truly had this now become the lair of the corrupter. The Wood Elves advanced through groves of blood-red grass and trees that wept black tears. Way Watchers advanced before and behind the main host. Ariel had learnt the lessons of his previous hunt. For days there was no sign of the beasts they sought, but other challenges there were aplenty. Many dryads and treekin had accompanied Ariel's host, but they seethed with rage at the fate of what had once been a verdant paradise. The forest was hungry for flesh, and many elves were devoured by gaping bowls or torn limb from limb by vines. Here and there they found skeletal bodies of Bretonian knights who had ended their grail quests as mulch for the corruption. The mutated forest creatures scuttled through the undergrowth, mad eyes shining horribly in the darkness as their razor-sharp teeth glistened with poison. At last, the host of Athaloran came up upon a blasted glade, in which Morghur and his war herd were gathered. A colossal herdstone had been raised in the very centre of the clearing in the rubble of its core, the remains of a once proud Grail chapel. And it was upon this summit that the corrupter capered and yowled. Catching sight of his prey at last, Ariel knocked an arrow into his mighty longbow and let fly. The shot sped true. It struck Morghur from the herdstone, wounded but alive. The signal for battle given, the elves let out their war cries and charged into the glade. Desperate was the battle in that glade, for the Wood Elves and the forest spirits did battle not only with the beastmen, but also the twisted creatures of Arden that came at Morghur's call. Yet the warriors of Athaloran pressed on, ignoring the gobbets of flesh torn from their limbs by frenzied mouths and the poison loosed into their veins by envenomed claws. Dryads formed the vanguard of the attack. Their blows lent greater strength by kindled rage. With a mighty roar, a colossal Gorgon rose up out of the war herd and scattered the Dryads, but was soon overwhelmed and torn apart by the relentless treekin who surged forward in the Dryads' wake. The Way Watchers hung back, under the shadow of the trees, their shots always seeking those who bellowed commands, directing the war herds. Doom Bulls and Beast Lords fell dead upon the scorched glade, arrows protruding from eyes and open mouths. In the centre of the glade, Bestigors clashed with Ariel's eternal guard, and fared the poorer for the exchange. Spears flashed like sunlight in the dark, and slew many of the foul creatures before their crude axes could be hefted. The Bestigors fought to the last brutish warrior, and many an elf was hewed before the last beastman fled. Ariel hardly noticed. He had eyes only for Morghur, and with the Bestigors eliminated, the Lord of Talsine now had the chance to strike directly at his foe. Before Ariel had left Athaloran, Ariel had gifted him a gourd of sap harvested from the Oak of Ages, and he now unstoppered that container and flung the enchanted contents into Morghur's face. No purer liquid existed in all the world, and where it touched Morghur's flesh, white flames rose up. Soon the corruptor was all ablaze, his strange mewling cries provoking both pity and joy. Soon the creature was naught but ash, his threat ended for as long as it took him to be reborn. With Morghur's death, the rest of the beastmen were soon scattered. Araloth bade the herdstone be toppled, and a great pyre be lit in the centre of the glade, so that the corrupted bodies of the foe could be cleansed. This work done, the wood elves left the forest, but they did so slowly. Not all the sap had been used to destroy Morghur, and Ariel now placed a drop of what remained at the base of each corrupted tree that he passed. Each time, the enchanted sap wrought its magic, the purifying fire sprang up, yet the flames did not consume the trees as they had Morghur, but merely burnt away his corruption. Thus did the Lord of Talsine bring new life to the forest of Arden. After that, it was accounted amongst the hallowed places in Bretonnia, though there was never a damsel or knight in that upstart realm who ever truly learned the reason why.